Hello and welcome to our series, Dinis Guarda, Open Business Council, citiesabc, YouTube podcast series and profiles. So today we have someone that I'm particularly excited to interview and to talk. And it's not every day that we have someone that is doing this kind of research and as well working in probably the most important area for the future of human civilization. I'll start like this because I think it's no pressure. No, but I'm quite excited. So I welcome Olivia Gambelin, that is the CEO and co-founder of the Beneficial AI Society that sits on the advisory board of the Tech Scotland, and the advocates as well on the founding editorial board of Spring Nature's AI and Ethics journal. So welcome to our series, first of all, Olivia.
Thank you, Dinis. And that was quite an introduction. I hope I live up to it.
No. Well, your profile is impressive. So I'll just go through a bit of some of your background. So from Silicon Valley, you've been working in digital marketing for tech startups, and following your graduation on honors college from Baylor University, as well starting with philosophy and entrepreneurship, which is a fantastic mix. You moved overseas and pursued opportunities to expand in the areas of GDPR and data privacy research in Brussels. And then you did a master in philosophy and especially concentration in AI and ethics on the University of Edinburgh. And during this time in Scotland, you co-founded the Beneficial AI Society. And as well, that was completed with your dissertation and distinction on the effects of probability of the moral responsibility of autonomous cars, which is probably the most well-known case of AI ethics, and as well the AI kind of benchmark, at least that we have in terms of mainstream society. And as well, you've been working as an ethic consultancy, specializing in emerging technologies, and launched the company with initial 3 clients, which is quite impressive: the Franklin Templeton, the IoT department, the University of Edinburgh, and as well the Data for Children collaborative with UNICEF. So it's a fantastic profile. And as well, right now, Olivia, in terms of the work as CEO of Ethical Intelligence, she leads a remote team, over 30 experts of tech ethics field, and sits on the advisory board of Tech Scotland, the advocates and actively contributes to the development of AI ethics in business through keynote speaking and through pieces. So welcome to our series. It's a fantastic profile. I'm looking forward to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Dinis, and thank you for having me today. It's always funny listening to my profile read out loud. It's like listening to an autobiography without actually having ever written one, but thank you.
No, it's very impressive. So I think you have a fantastic background. So I would like to start, I always like to start by the early stage of your career, but as well, bearing in mind the complexity of topics that you are dealing with, from entrepreneurship and business and technology to ethics and philosophy. I'd like to see how did that came to you, and how do you, which are areas that I'm very personally excited and as well very involved on my own. But how did that happen with you? And I think a bit of the background that made you who you are.
Well, I think it starts really, I grew up in the heart of the Silicon Valley, and that's where I'm currently today. But growing up here, the area around here, we kind of become these guinea pigs for testing. So all of the new tech, we've seen it probably about 2 or 3 years before it goes mainstream. So we've got these robots here that deliver food. We had the chefs in the home kitchen where they would deliver a package of a pre-prepared meal, I think about 5 years before that one became mainstream. So we in this area become these guinea pigs for testing. And with that, we grow up kind of speaking technology. I like to say that my second language was actually to speak techie. It's a certain lingo out here. And with that, I think it inspired a lot of my interest, my early on interest into artificial intelligence. Of course, I decided I want to be a bit rebellious, and I went to actually Texas to do my undergrad, where I started in physics, figured out that I loved the theory behind it, not so much the calculus, and ended up switching to philosophy. And then about halfway through that degree, I added on entrepreneurship. And I like to say that the entrepreneurship drive comes from growing up in the Valley, where everyone is an entrepreneur. It's kind of like in school, you're asked, okay, what kind of business are you going to start when you grow older? Instead of, will you start a business? It's what kind of business, it's assumed. So taking on entrepreneurship as well was a natural progression for me. Philosophy was more of my intellectual love, and entrepreneurship was, well, I need to be a bit economically minded. And I completely confused the university trying to combine the two of those subjects. I remember my advisors were always laughing every time I came in. You go, why are you in this department when you're supposed to be in this department? I was like, I'm combining them. I think they go great together. So that was a bit of my start to combining things that lots of people would normally think have no relation to each other.
Well, that's really impressive. But I think I want to go to your childhood. Sorry, I don't want to do psychology, but I'm particularly excited to know about that, because I think I had the same problem in university when I started looking at literature and media and technology, where I actually literally had 3 coordinators of my course, and each of them were passing me one to the other in ping pong when I did my MA, so my master in science. So I understand completely your point and your concerns. But this is kind of right now, the irony is that universities are still challenging on this when they should be leading this. Of course, there are some universities, but I would just, going back to your education before university, because I think that probably makes this part, entrepreneurial and philosophy, are really key. And I think if you look at it, even some of the leading corporations in the world are taking this very serious. But you have more and more people in your areas right now behind companies, because of course, if you don't have these areas, you have a serious problem. But of course, very few people have the philosophy and the entrepreneurship. You might have the technology in some parts. I would like to touch that area before we go to more of your career.
Oh, so my education, even before, well, apologies. Are you talking about my high school education?
Yeah, no, high school education and even family background, of course, whatever you want to share with us. I want to touch this because I think it's interesting for people listening to us, and especially parents and actually even teenagers or people in universities, to look at these things, because I think sometimes even me with my teenagers and I've been teaching as well, one of the things that I find very awkward and very difficult is to explain that the concept of a career, the concept of working for one area is not going to exist anymore, at least the way it's been existing. But even teenagers don't want to believe it. so I want to touch that, because I think it's interesting to look at someone with your profile and achievements and understand as well that that journey. Sorry, if you want, of course, to share with us.
No, that's great. I can't remember the last time someone asked me about my high school experience, which is why I was sitting there going, did he actually ask about my high school experience? Yeah, that
I did.
He did. Well, it's so funny. I mean, you get so far down the line and people are like, oh, let's talk about masters. Let's talk about research. And I rarely ever let's talk about high school. Whereas I do believe my high school years did have a lot to shape me. I mean, for example, so I went to St. Francis High School. It's right near the Google campus. We had iPads. Each student in the class had iPads. So from very early on, I already had that technical literacy. But I do remember I think it was an English literature class. I'm trying to remember which one. But I remember one of my teachers said, look around the classroom. 75% of you sitting in this classroom will have a career in an area that has not yet been invented yet. Like you'll have a job position, you'll have a job title that doesn't exist yet. And for some reason that echoes in my mind still to today, because now working as an AI ethicist, back then they did not exist. So I'm part of that statistic. I am part of that 75%. But wow, that's actually a very good question. Back in high school, I guess I was always more drawn towards the philosophical courses and physics, which was a funny split. But I loved the theory behind physics again, and I loved how those connected. I loved being able to see how things worked in the world. And I think philosophy for me is still this exploration of how do things work in the world, not necessarily the things that we can see and touch and quantify, but the beyond, that qualitative area where it's confusing, but I think brings a lot of meaning to life. And even back in high school, I remember taking courses specifically because I knew the teacher liked to do these philosophical discussions where all the other kids in the classroom were like, ah, groaning, we don't want to do this. Why? Just give us the test. Let's move forward. But I loved those conversations early on. And they actually helped direct me towards deciding to switch my focus in my undergrad from physics to philosophy. Yeah, and then you also asked about my family heritage. So I'm I'm Italian Irish. My mom's half is Irish. My dad's half is Italian. I think I'm about second generation here, but I grew up in a very Italian household, very Italian household, where we had the big family dinners. We had, my grandfather built a pizza oven in the backyard. And all the grandkids would go over and he would teach us how to make focaccia or pizza. And I think growing up in that very loving household where it's everyone together, everyone's loud. I notice I'm very loud in business nowadays. But I think having to learn how to work with the different personalities has helped now as I try and lead these massive projects and with these teams, knowing how to deal with people that are very loud and very quiet and how to get them to work together. I think I could probably thank all those family Christmas dinners for being able to understand how to handle multiple personalities at once.
Amazing, and I think that shows as well the strengths of your background, but as well some of the things that took the road to where we are now. And I think I always like to go through that because you find the most awkward things, but as well you look at humanity, which is something you do in your work, and that humanity is key, especially for, first of all, to look at the way you're going to be looking at the next decades, because I think there's a big shift, and that I think I'll take right now to your education, probably both the master and PhD, or all the different education you had. I'm particularly interested so as you wed this kind of journey between education and philosophy and entrepreneurship, and then you probably went more in technology, and of course you are really a daughter of Silicon Valley, which is quite impressive if you grew up there. It's a beautiful place, but I never imagined people living there. I always imagine the corporations that I visit. So it's amazing that you effectively live there. So I just want to, so mostly how did you balance this precisely the research and as well as you evolve in your education between the different areas? And of course, AI right now is completely in trend, especially in the last decade, but it's mostly in the last 5 years that has been kind of taking the hegemony that it has right now. So just the balance between that education and as well, how did you got into this from that entrepreneurial and as well intellectual background?
I like to say that I stand with one foot in industry and one foot in academia. I work very closely with academics. All of our experts at ethical intelligence are, I want to say about 90% of them are academics. We have that small little group that work as consultants right now. But being able to stand with both feet in these different areas has actually been very helpful and something required, since, as you said, academia is on the cutting edge of a lot of this research from an ethical standpoint, not necessarily AI. We have all of the industry and the startups and big tech trying to push the boundaries of AI, but not necessarily paying attention to the holistic picture of what encapsulates AI. Building the actual product is only one part of the whole picture. You still have the policy, you have the ethics, you have the societal impact that is also a part of that picture of AI, that holistic view of AI. And that kind of research is really being pushed ahead by academics. So being able to sit in between with the development of the ethics research, I have to sit halfway in academia, which is interesting because I am more squarely in industry, but going into academia, I get a lot of looks of, you've betrayed us, you've gone into industry. And then I get well, I'd like to move into industry and be able to work in industry. So almost acting as that bridge for academics to get their research out of the philosophical armchair and into practical application. so I required to actually almost stay up to date as possible as I can on my research side, while maintaining this knowledge, while maintaining a finger on the pulse of tech to see how it's developing, at what pace it's developing from an industry standpoint, because there is a very big disconnect between the two. And I've noticed this a lot, where I have academics coming to me saying, well, this matters. We need from an ethics standpoint, this matters. Why isn't anyone listening? And it's not that they're not listening, it's that they're not speaking the right language, so to speak. You can't necessarily go up to an engineer and talk to them about moral responsibility. They'll just kind of look at you like, okay, and what does this do for my source code? I don't care, unless this is going to help me meet my deadline. But if you go up to them and start talking about, well, not more responsibility, but you start talking to them about this will, if you don't pay attention to this decision that you're making, you can actually cost your company millions of dollars in reputational damage, or you will result in a weaker product. You have to learn the language to speak to the industrial side, and the industrial side needs to learn the language to speak to the academics, because they're coming on the other side with this idea of, we know we need ethics, just put it on, like physically take ethics and put it onto our machinery. And so they need to learn how to speak to the academics of, okay, we don't actually physically take and put ethics. This is the exact problem that we're facing. And so it's a miscommunication on both ends. So I have to stay up to date in both areas to be able to act as, I call myself a translator at times between these two different mindsets in AI and ethics, especially.
No, I think I think everyone, even for us, if you're looking at, especially the challenge right now is probably how the different research between the academic and the industry, and then the business, because we have to separate as well. Each business is different, and as well then the rest of the public, which is the paradox that we have in our civilization, and as well the challenge that we are facing. So one of the things I'm particularly excited, so in terms of your career, you've been actually doing very serious research that has been always, like you mentioned, between these different areas. So probably if you could tell us about the master you did in philosophy with the University of Edinburgh, especially in the AI and ethics, and which is quite interesting in the way you deliver it, which is probably the base to create the company that you're leading right now. So I think I'm particularly interested in that, and especially the bridge between the academy, what I've been teaching, although I don't have time right now, and as well the industry, which I think is very important. I think that background gives you a level of bridge and knowledge that is unique. And that's why I think your profile is so necessary, and people like you can actually lead the world in these discussions.
Thank you. You flatter me again. Yeah, so my master's up in the University of Edinburgh, it is a philosophy of science. And I remember going in very seriously, walking in on the first day to the advisor, my poor advisors, and going, I'm here to study AI ethics. I saw your courses. I'm going to tailor make this master's. I will write my master's dissertation in AI ethics. That's what I'm here for. I want to come. I want to be able to push this field forward. Because essentially right before that master's, I was in Brussels and I was a researcher in data privacy. And I remember in a conference one day, I had a light bulb moment. Sounds cheesy, but I had this moment where the woman on stage is talking about data ethics. And it was like my interest in philosophy and my love of technology came crashing together. It was this moment of, well, of course, that's the area that I want to look into. So I started digging into data ethics, and basically that is, we'll say that's like the doorway into AI ethics. Data ethics is a bit further ahead than AI ethics. They're interconnected, but there's further research in data ethics just because of, well, there's further policy in data ethics as well. GDPR is one of those vanguard policies that came through. But I digress. So I came out of industry when I saw that there was this connection that I could take from my philosophy background of which I was always fascinated with ethics and morality and my understanding of technology, and could match those two together. So when I went into that master's in Edinburgh, I was very serious. I knew exactly what I was there for and what I wanted to get out of it. It was thanks to Dr. Mark Spivak's Ethics of AI course itself that I think is, for lack of a better term, it was a life-changing course. Mark did a fantastic job. He taught in this flipped classroom style, and it was a mixed classroom. So it was technically listed as a philosophy course, but we were half philosophy students and half, there's actually an AI master's at Edinburgh as well. So they combined us together for this course. And I think that was the moment where I started making these connections of, oh, there's a disconnect here again. Because the philosophy students, we would be explaining or researching or discussing a very specific, nuanced idea. And then you'd have the AI students sitting there going, well, this is the solution done. So it's very different mindsets, very different thought patterns about how to arrive at the solutions. And I'm listening to how they're working. And that was the first clue in of, this is, you know, there's some type of miscommunication going here. And when you put the two of us, these two profiles in the room together, if you can get people speaking on the same wavelength, then that's when you start to see the real solutions pulled out of all of that confusion and actually pulled out of it. So I think it was thanks to that class that set me in the first direction of being able to work with the different profiles coming from AI, machine learning, and philosophy and policy, and learning that as long as I could get them to speak the same tone, the same language, then that's where a lot of these solutions were able to be pulled out. And that's a lot of the work that we do today now at Ethical Intelligence is that same kind of combination of the technical minded and the philosophical minded, working them through our methodology and being able to pull out the robust solutions out of them. I digress. I can come back to my research at Edinburgh. I got very excited there.
No, it's amazing. So I'm particularly interested on that, but I want to, because I think your master was precisely about the morals of self-driven vehicles, which is kind of probably one of the biggest case studies in moral. I think it's actually the mainstream one. And probably you were part of that. So I would like to touch that, I think, especially for people listening to us, because I think when we speak about philosophy, there'll be the people that love it and people that will be, okay, also philosophy is probably more for philosophers. And then the ones in AI, or the ones in AI, okay, well, let me see. But I think everyone in AI is looking at these things very serious. But I just want to understand a bit after that journey. And I think that digress is very important to understand as well the complexity of what you're doing, but as well how, for instance, Edinburgh is one of the top 10 universities in the world in computing science and in general. So if they are not so prepared, imagine the rest of the world. So I think it's very important to highlight these things as well, because I think that's probably, this is a challenge that we're facing, but I think it's going to be accelerated in a lot of areas.
Definitely. Yeah, but I'll talk about then my research during that master's degree. And I think now, whenever I mention to people that I studied the more responsibility of, well, I'll say self-driving cars is a shorthand. I usually try and say autonomous vehicles and see if it works. I'm continuously asked, do you run over the baby or the grandmother or the 5 people versus the 1 person? So that's people can get very creative about who to run over in that scenario. I think I've heard all different combinations of people. What if you run over this person versus this person? Anyway, I was looking at a very specific, not problem, we'll say, but a very specific area of that moral responsibility. And it's something called the probability intuition, which hasn't been written about as much as I think it, well, I personally think it needs to, but the probability intuition was actually something that I picked up from conversations with computer scientists. What I noticed in these conversations is whenever I was trying to start a conversation about really the moral responsibility of these self-driving cars, the answer was always, oh, well, it doesn't matter, because as soon as we make these machines perfect, then there's no moral responsibility. It's fine. And that always caught the wrong way for me. I was thinking that doesn't sound right. Why doesn't that sound right to me? So I actually did my master's research into that conception of, as the probability for an accident decreases, does the moral responsibility for those accidents also decrease? Because that was the rhetoric that was being used, that was the natural progression. From the result of my research, it actually goes in the opposite direction. And let me explain it. So as the probability for an accident decreases, so the car crashes less and less often, those crashes turn out to be more and more, not catastrophic, but more and more bizarre, like harder to prevent. A tree falls on the road and the car swerves and hits something, things that you can't predict. We'll never have perfect self-driving cars that will never crash. There's just too many external factors to account for. So the concept of we'll reach perfection just doesn't exist. There's that small little gap of, there will be, they're called acts of God. There'll be acts of God and these cars will still crash. For example, that tree falling. So as that probability though for the crashes decrease and there are less and less crashes, the conception of the moral responsibility actually increases. It doesn't decrease. So as we're creating better and better self-driving cars, we expect these cars not to crash. And when they do, then our conception of the responsibility for them is increased. I haven't worked out the exact formula yet for what that increase looks like compared to the decrease in probability, but the idea is, this car is so good, why would it crash? It should not have crashed. And once that gets into people's minds and that car does crash, then they're looking at it going, that shouldn't have happened. For example, think about, say you have two friends. You've got one that you know lies all the time, and then you have the other one that always tells the truth. And the one that's lying all the time, you expect them to lie. So they tell a lie, you're like, well, I knew this was coming. But the friend that you have that never tells lies, if they suddenly tell a lie, your conception of the responsibility for that lie is increased with the friend that never tells the lie. You're sitting there going, but you don't do this. Why would you tell a lie? Normally, you shouldn't be telling a lie. And that works the same with the cars. A poor self-driving car, if it crashes, we've already accepted that risk. We already know that this car will probably crash, versus the car that we expect not to crash. When it crashes, there's this feeling of unfairness, this feeling that justice has not been served. It's why did you crash? You shouldn't have. So I was looking at that very specific nuance of, actually, as we create better and better algorithms, machinery, this applies beyond autonomous vehicles, but as we create better systems, we expect more out of them. And when they fail, then we have a bigger sense of responsibility. We have a bigger sense that the responsibility of those algorithms hasn't been met, that they have failed in that morality area. And I, continuing off of that, and what I hope to continue now into this day, is the difference between praise and blame when it comes to any type of machinery. We're so focused on who to blame if something goes wrong, but my fear is there's no question being asked of who to praise when something goes right, because we see as things go less and less wrong, as there's less and less blame to admit, there is actually more and more praise because things are going right. And praise and blame, of course, don't work in the same way. We're faster to blame than we are to praise, but there is still something. If you create the perfect self-driving car, there's an immense amount of praise behind that. But who does the praise go to? Does it go to the car? Does it go to the engineering team? Does it go to the company? It's still the same questions as that we're asking with who to blame when the car runs over someone. So the purpose of that research was more to highlight the fact that the probability intuition, the answer that it's okay we don't need to figure out these problems. We'll just make the perfect car and then we won't have to deal with any of this ethics stuff is dangerous. You're treading into water where you're going to miss a lot of these important questions, and you're going in blind to the situation that you are now creating for yourself. So that is not so much a brief, but sort of an overview of the research that I was doing specifically during that master's degree, and hope to continue very soon as well.
No, it's really, and I think this is definitely one of the major areas, especially when it comes to ethics and AI, that has been used as the benchmark, but as well the complexity. But of course, since then, there's a lot of other things. And so I think so can you tell us about the ethical intelligence that you created, the organization, which is, we cannot say is a startup organization and think tank, let's put it that way, probably in a lot of ways, but just to, what is the organization and how you're leading this? I think it's particularly interesting for people listening to us and understanding worldwide.
Yeah, thank you. So Ethical Intelligence, we're an AI ethics advisory firm. And our mission is to bring the human back into the equation. So we're looking specifically for human-centric solutions. And since the pandemic began, prior to the pandemic, we were working with big enterprise. As you listed some of our first clients, these were big scale projects. We were working on protocols, we were working on frameworks, very operational heavy. The pandemic struck, and what we noticed, we, of course, like everyone else, started hosting virtual events. We had webinars, we had workshops, and we still do to this day. But what we noticed were the people coming to these resources weren't people from big enterprise. We had all the startup founders coming to us. We had startups, we had engineers, we had everyone that was working on the COVID tech, that cutting edge COVID tech. And they were coming to us saying, we have no resources into AI ethics. We know we're in a very risky area, so to speak. We're dealing with highly personal technology. For example, with the contact tracing, we're dealing with contact tracing for people. And we all remember the big conversations that first broke out between, do we trade our privacy for our health and those. And so we actually had the people working on these technologies coming to us saying, we need to help. We need to bootstrap our own knowledge. We're coming to anything we can find on the internet that has anything to do with AI ethics. We have no resources. So we started listening to that, and taking a step back, we noticed that the organizations that exist in our grassroots community, small but growing community, we'll say, in AI ethics, there's a handful of us that exist out there. We noticed that we were doing a really great job of servicing big enterprise and being able to support the institutions that had the finances to basically commission the research that needs to go behind a lot of these protocols and frameworks. But no one was really sitting as a very serious resource for the smaller guys, for the SMEs, for the startups. There's plenty of resources out there, but a lot of it were philosophical discussions. It wasn't, when you work in a startup, it's make or break. You need the answer and you need it now, or yesterday really, and you need to keep up with this pace of innovation. You don't necessarily have time to sit and have these fascinating philosophical conversations, but you don't necessarily have that time. You're looking for answers. We were noticing that there was this gap for those startups and those SMEs. So since the pandemic, then we've gone through this shift, and now we work directly with startups and SMEs. We focus more on training, since that allows them to keep pace with their actual technology, instead of coming in and putting in this protocol and this heavy framework that they have to follow, which first of all slows down any smaller company. It slows them down. And that framework, as soon as it's issued, needs to be continuously updated because of the pace of research going on from the ethics side, to keep it relevant. So instead of bringing in these heavy frameworks, we noticed that if we train the person to spot the problems, and we train them on the methodology that's the logical methodology that comes out of ethics, then those startup founders, those engineers, those programmers, it becomes second nature to ask these questions and look for these answers that need to be considered when it comes to ethics. So it's a different shift. So at Ethical Intelligence, we have something called the Equation, and this is a training resource. It's a monthly cycle. Each month we have a different theme. And so we start to pick themes that we notice are hot topics of conversation, so to speak. So last month we did well-being. This month we're looking at AI product design, and the next month we'll look at bias. And the whole idea there is we curate a plethora of different resources. So it's either in podcast form, it's in written blog case study form, we host these virtual pub chats, so group discussion form. We have these different forums, but it's all curated around the same common theme. And the idea there is, if you are busy, if you are running a startup, if you are an engineer, you don't have much extra time, you at least know that you can log in and go, okay, I have this for the month. I have one thing a week. There's small little snippets, and I can essentially train myself on how to identify and mitigate ethical risk, as well as one of the amazing things that we're noticing working more and more with startups is ethics can actually be used as innovation strategy. And so we're starting to focus more on that innovation side as well. Risk is good to consider, but we can also use ethics as a growth tool. And that's a lot of what we've been up to in these past months with Ethical Intelligence.
Well, really impressive. So I think there's two parts that I would like to touch in the way you work. And I think it's interesting for our audience, and especially for the project of Open Business Council and citiesabc, which is something that it has a lot of synergy, especially in the sense of the importance of creating awareness for these problems, which is what made you create as well the platform and the company. And I think so. My first question is definitely for people. Well, I think right now that on one end there's general business that are looking at these topics, and I think everyone should be. But like you said, there's a lot of contradictions. Let's say if you are in the US, you have one thing. If you are in Europe, you have another one. Even between different countries in Europe, it's still a block, but it's still, you have, for instance, data protection is completely different in German from what it is in the UK. And it goes on and on. And especially if you go to China, of course, it's a completely different ball game. And then of course, even Japan as well. So if I'm just looking some of the biggest countries. So one of the things that I'm particularly interested in, the first part of what you're doing, is how do you deal with this complexity of data and complexity of lack of first of all, lack of even any regulatory part on this, because at the moment, I think the only consensual is that a robot cannot create a patent. I think it's probably one of the few concepts that are assumed. But yeah, there's still a lot of issues there. I just would like to touch this, yeah.
It's a very complex question. So first of all, our expert network, we keep a network. There's 40 or so. We're adding a few more this week, actually. But there's 40 or so experts. We take them from academia. They're, so to speak, are pre-approved consultants, but we work closely with them on our consulting projects. We work with them to develop our workshops. Our experts actually span all 5 continents. So we did that on purpose. We wanted to have the different cultural inputs, first of all. So when we work with a client, we make sure that at least one of our experts is from that culture. And that's just so we have that cultural awareness. From that, you bring up a very interesting point about the legal versus the ethical. And this is a big question now, especially in the States, as people are pushing for policy, for regulation here. They're saying, well, we just need regulation and then we'll be fine. That's not true. You can be legal and still unethical. What happens is you get this baseline. The law is only supposed to establish if we're speaking in techie terms, the minimum viable product. It's only supposed to establish that baseline where you have to reach this. But societal expectation is above that. societal expectation is where something called soft ethics comes into play, where it's not tied to a law, but instead tied to these societal values, to these ethical principles. What we currently work with is all of these different countries have ethics policies. They're not regulations, so to speak, but you have, for example, the high-level expert group has their ethics guideline. The UK has something called the UK guidance. Beijing has the Beijing principles. There are these lists of principles, so to speak. And as you start to look at them, you see commonalities. For example, the one that always gets people is transparency. That's listed on every single policy, including the Beijing one, including the UK, which we would think would be vastly different cultures and would not have the same principles in mind. The nuances there is we have these, we can call them almost universal truths. We have these ethical principles. It's how they're carried out in each culture that we start to see the differences. And so when we work with our clients, we first and foremost understand their own culture and where they're situated. So if it's a UK client, we're looking at the UK guidance, we're looking at any potential regulation coming out in the near future, but what society in the UK would expect from this technology. And then as that technology expands to, say, the EU or even globally, saying, okay, here are almost, they're not red flags, but here are your pain points where you might have to adjust, because transparency, for example, in the UK is not the same as transparency in Beijing. And having that awareness, instead of forcing your own cultural perspectives onto the through the technology onto a different culture, but instead looking at how that culture functions, and matching the technology to how that culture functions, is something very important. So that is actually a very big question that goes around it. You actually pulled out two really important topics as of late, is this call for regulation, this idea that government will be our savior in up against big tech. That's not true. It's the consumer that's going to actually make a difference there. And then when we have these different cultures, how do we work with them? Well, it's first of all, having an awareness that there are different cultures goes a long way.
No, I think it's going to be a very critical element, especially if you look at the future of not just AI, but technology in general, because at the moment we are in a very fragmented geopolitical world, and humanity is not going to change. So we're just going to have a lot of different things. So I want to go just right now, still on your company. So I know that you're doing a lot of things. So any case study that you have, and I know that you've been working from countries to universities to parliaments and to a lot of different things, any case studies, and especially the Scottish government as well, because I think one of the things, especially when it comes to these things, is the case studies, is looking at things that are really, that we can actually look and see. And I think that helps a lot, especially the work I've been doing with governments and even the books I've been writing and evolving. I believe that initially I wanted to be more conceptual or intellectual, and I understood, like, let's go down to earth, and sometimes do that. Of course, you can have both, but I understand completely. So I would like to have that. I know that you've been doing, you mentioned podcasts and different things, but let's say one case study or two that you suggest, especially where these things are really well used. Let's say a positive case study and probably a negative, just to have a bit of both.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I will give you, I've got two different ones. One of my favorite, it's a company called Hypergiant out of Austin, Texas. And they're space tech, which is very cool. But they have this, his name's Will Griffin, and he is their chief ethics officer. Will is one of the smartest people I know, and he has a way of speaking with engineers that's, it's amazing. And at Hypergiant, they've actually set up an ethical code. And one of the things that Will always likes to say, and I constantly quote him now, actually, it's a case study that they did when they implemented this ethical code. They used kind of a deontological perspective. But he was saying how prior to having that code, they would present a problem to their engineering department and would say, hey, we need a solution. And their engineers would work and they'd come back with 3 or 4 different potential solutions. And they were good solutions. There was nothing wrong. There was nothing wrong with them per se, but there were 3 to 4 solutions. Then Will went through and implemented this code of ethics and tried it again, presented a problem to the engineering department, said we needed a solution. And on the back end, after working with that code of ethics, the engineers came back with 10, 12 beautifully robust solutions. And it was that qualitative difference where the first solutions met the problem, met the requirements that needed to be solved, but the solutions that came after that code of ethics, there was just a whole new quality to them. It was a different level of innovation, a different level of solution coming into the picture. And so Will always talks about this, of saying how you can use ethics for that kind of innovation, how it actually helps an engineering department. It doesn't slow them down as the concept is, but that it helps them grow, helps them innovate, helps them come up with better, robust solutions on the other side. So that's the first one. And Will's got great podcasts and everything. If you just Google him, he's I love listening to him. I know whenever we talk, I'll sit and just forget to respond. I'm nodding along going, yes, this makes sense. And of course, Will, and he's a great guy. Then another case study, maybe less of a case study, an ongoing one, we'll say. We're working with a company right now. They're called Anyone Technologies, and they're out of the UK. They're pretty new, and they are a marketplace for 5-minute conversations. And we had their founder approach us a few months back. He comes to us, and he's ex-Google. He comes to us and he's like, I swear I would never get back into technology unless I knew what I was doing ethically. And his whole perspective there was from his past experiences. He saw how important having guidance in ethics was. So we've been working now for about a month into working with Anyone, the company. And we've been working with Anyone, the company, to understand what ethical dilemmas, we'll say, exist within their technology, within their business, and spot those pieces and either mitigate them, so block them from happening. Say there's a catastrophic one. How do we block that from happening? Or when we find those pieces, how do we actually flip it around so it's something positive? So we can actually create potential business growth out of what used to be a red flag, instead take it into a different perspective so that it doesn't get to that red flag spot and it is actually something good on the other side. So we've been working with Anyone for about a month. We're very, very early on. It's not a complete case story yet, but that's been a fantastic project to work on, especially to see a founder come in and be so passionate about both his technology and wanting to do it right. That's been a great experience on both ends for us. But that's an example of a company that's starting from day one with their product and going, we know we have to make these decisions down the line. Let's actually consider them at day one instead of accidentally making these decisions without any awareness down the line as the product development amps up, we'll say.
Yeah, that's very good cases and actually very useful for people listening to us. And I think for me as well, I think it's really I think the devil's on details, and especially how you deal with these challenges and the opportunities that come of that, but as well, how you face them and how you create a narrative and as well, some intelligence around that. So moving forward, and we passed 1 hour, so I'll try to keep, although I have a lot of questions for you, but so one of the things that I would like to talk, and I think especially now go a bit broader, and I think people listening to us, of course, will put all the links for what you suggest and for your company, and as well, we've been doing a lot of fantastic research, podcasts and interviews, so I'll put all of this, and of course we'll have as well a wiki page for you. But so one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is, so going a bit more macro, is so And now I'm going a bit more of future of civilizations. If you look at, for instance, one of the last books of Yuval Noah Harari is precisely about Homo Deus. So I want to go right now a bit out of the scope of conventional things. So my question for you is, how do you see as an ethic technologist and as well as a startup? So you are dealing with this on the day-to-day. And of course, we are right now in a, let's say, the first stage of AI, which is very incipient, and mostly we're talking just a rudimentary AI, whatever name you can use. But we have already quite big cases like what is happening in the last 4 years in the United States, where you are right now, which was an entire disruption, or in the UK, where we've been living as well with the disruption of Brexit, which was partly created by manipulation of data. And in a very small scale, we're not talking about big scales and about what you're talking about AI, we're talking just about very basic psychometric data and hacking databases and creating different things. So there's already a big ethical issue here. I interviewed Brittany Eisen, and she's been, of course, became an activist after her tenure in Cambridge Analytica. But one of the things that I've been looking in one end is that this is just the drop in the ocean. And coming back to Professor Yuval Noah Harari, is that if you look at Homo Deus, I completely subscribe what he's saying, and this is my opinion, of course, in the sense that we are right now creating superhumans, and as well creating almost, I think, three kinds. I would put a bit more of complexity in what he describes as first-class humans and second-class humans and superhumans. But I would put as well that at the moment you're creating a huge part of the world that is becoming, first of all, not contextualized about what we're talking here. And for them, this probably is rock science, but as well understanding that these people are using technology on a day-to-day. Everyone uses AI indirectly through the sensors of a phone or through the sensors of the bots that are pushing content and different things. But this is kind of very, very basic. So as AI becomes bigger, how do you see this kind of challenge? Because at the moment there's, let's say, look at what we just touched, and I'll try to, it's a big question, but I want to just touch this with you, is that we have the complexity of looking just as the ethics regulating AI. For instance, we have, as we speak, there's a massive war between Facebook and Apple, which is in itself another podcast. Then we have as well the challenges of this being introduced in terms of healthcare data, and you can start predicting death, life extension, and things like that, which is as well happening. There's Google bought a multi-billion-dollar company focused in life extension. So we have that as well. But then we are accelerating that with the idea, for instance, just a couple of weeks ago, the US Intelligence and Department of Defense, under one study made by Eric Schmidt, which created Google, and he was the first CEO, mentioned that we need to look at AI to be able to deploy weapons. Of course, the thesis is a bit different. And then we have, on the other hand, for instance, the French army, that they actually put an ethical document, or whatever you call it, about the use of engineering soldiers in the French army. So this is happening now. I'm not talking in 5 years or 10, whatever the stuff. So how do you deal with this complexity from the present, but as well looking at the future that we are building now? And I think as well, if you don't take action now, of course, we're going to have a serious issue. And then, for instance, just as a last note and as a provocation, one of the challenge I have is, for instance, I'm probably second hold in my team, and we have people around the world, and all the team is less digital than me, which scares me a lot. And everyone, of course, spends 5-10 hours on devices, but no one even thinks about these things. So I just want to, I know that this is important, but I want to touch, I know that it's very complex, but this is, of course, an open question.
Oh, I have so many pieces I want to say now. This is actually a great lead into some current research I'm doing. I want to start, though, with just a point towards we are seeing a lot of these future conversations, so to speak, in terms of the singularity problem on having these automated, lethal autonomous weapon systems. Well, that's more of a current conversation, but these big conversations. And there's kind of like two scales. You have the big far-reaching ones that everyone likes to debate. That's the self-driving car, it's the autonomous weapons, it's those areas. And to those I answer, I actually want to reference here a researcher named Abeba Burhani. And I'm going to paraphrase what she said, but I think it's very poignant in terms of robot rights, since that's another conversation that keeps coming up. It's one of those high future-facing conversations. But she goes, why are we so concerned with the rights of robots when there are humans still without basic human rights? And I think that really encapsulates a lot of the frustration at times of why are we solving problems that don't necessarily need to be solved, when it's like we've been distracted into solving, can a robot vote, when it's when we still have humans that can't vote. I don't know why I used the vote as the analogy there, but that sense of needing to identify, does this problem actually need to be solved, or is there something more centric to struggle from human nature? So instead, for example, looking at, instead of making 10% of the population's life 1% better, how can we instead look at 90% of the population and make their lives 0.5% better even? So just looking at some of these applications, yes, it's fun to talk about these, but some of my fear is we get distracted by these big questions, especially the singularity problem, which is a big question coming in the future, but not necessarily what we're struggling with as humans. Yeah, in the present. Yeah.
I would say it's more present than it, and I think you make. Sorry to interrupt, but I think it's. I would say that this is very present. But sorry, I don't want to interrupt your train of thought. Yeah.
No. It leads into the research that I'm doing currently. So I've been digging into this concept of bravery in the face of technology. And the idea there was, I'm constantly surrounded with these conversations of people fearing technology, fearing what it does, not knowing how to understand it. As you were saying, our digital literacies are so mixed matched. I can use the perfect example. Lack of it, or yeah. Like teaching my grandmother how to use Facebook is very entertaining. I taught her how to use Facebook. I love her dearly. I might regret it a little bit because now I get letters to myself written on other people's photos that they've posted of me, which is always entertaining. But that digital literacy, I mean, we've all tried to sit down and teach one of our elderly relatives what a text message or an email is, and it's completely different. But that's almost an extreme of that lack of digital literacy, whereas it still exists on a basic level. I've noticed, for example, because I grew up, as we were saying at the beginning of this, my high school, I had an iPad in class with me. I had to learn how to incorporate technology into my study habits, into how I focused. So for me, I've had more practice, and I learned it from very early on, where I noticed even my friends, my peers, ones that weren't necessarily exposed to technology that early on, there is a different ability to adapt to new technology that exists. I can pick up a new piece of technology in no time. I think my favorite example there is when I give these talks and conferences, everyone has a different platform that they use. I don't necessarily need to be walked through it because I understand how these platforms are built. I can pretty much figure out how everything works. Give me a minute and I'll figure it out in no time. Whereas I'll have peers who are just as brilliant, if not more intelligent than myself, struggle at understanding, well, where's the comment button? How do I raise my hand on this application? And so that difference in digital literacies is incredibly important because we fear what we don't understand. And there's a lot of this idea that, oh, leave it to the technology practitioners. It's too complicated. I can't understand that. That's not true. You can explain a piece of technology in very basic, plain language so that a lay person, someone on the street, can understand. That's not happening. So of course, the general public starts to fear technology because they don't understand what's happening. They don't understand where their data is going. They know that they're supposed to know where their data is going and that they should protect it, but why should they protect their data? They have no idea where it's going. They really have no idea how it's being used. They didn't realize that someone could track, you know, how many times I brush my teeth a day and be down to that intimate level and use it to turn a profit on the other end. There's that missing piece of knowledge. So of course we're going to, as general society, fear a lot of these technological growths and applications. And with the scandals that come out, or not even scandals, for example, WhatsApp's change of terms and conditions and that massive switch towards Signal as a messaging app system, that one goes to show that nothing really changed in the terms and conditions. They just made it a little bit more evident where your data was going. And as soon as people knew what was going on, they knew they could say, I don't want this. And they could switch, but they didn't know or conceptualize beforehand. Anyway, I digress a bit, but one of the points about bravery is I'm looking at how do we change this? We have this fear of technology, not necessarily fear of technology itself, but fear of what people are using it for and fear of what it's doing to us. How do we actually change that so that we face these challenges and overcome them? And what that looks like from a societal perspective, from a company perspective. And which brings me back, I'm trying to circle back around to your, it was a really good question. I really liked the complexity of it. But which brings me back down to the consumer. And I was talking with Tanya Durate from We and AI. They're a non-for-profit in the UK, and they're trying to work on this educational gap. They have a plethora of resources in turn trying to educate the general public on this is what AI actually does. It's not this end all be all knowing omniscient technology. This is actually what it's comprised of. But I was talking with Tanya, and she was making a great point about how as consumers, when we act together, we actually have an immense amount of power. One of the struggles is as a company takes a step or tries to take a step forward in ethics or in, for example, even just in sustainability, it still depends on the consumer to actually act on that. If, for example, with plastic straws, we're trying to move away from plastic straws. Well, if consumers will still pick a plastic straw over out here we have bamboo straws now, a plastic straw over a bamboo straw because that's their preference, then plastic straws are still going to be the main straw manufactured. The consumer has power there to be able to choose between different technologies, between different straws. And if they're not choosing in the direction of what's more ethical, what's more sustainable, and instead they're choosing for convenience sake in other technologies that, or in other goods that aren't necessarily bad, but not ethically minded, then those ones are still going to prosper. There's immense power in the hands of the consumer to be able to, in a way, shape this direction. Again, that's one direction as well. Companies also have responsibility here. But one of the things I'm looking at is how can the consumer be more aware of what they're consuming, and how can they, with that awareness, be able to help shape some of these technologies. Yeah, so and the bravery to do so, since it does go a bit against what you would naturally, what we've been naturally trained on. And I keep wanting to make a point, and I keep almost getting there and losing it for a second. So I'll pause there. I know I had an ending point. It'll come back in just a second.
No, I think you touched very important. I like your sense of bravery because it's a very important thing. And I think actually, I did a recent research about, as I mentioned before, about the human dark side. And actually, when I interviewed Ben Gortzel, one of the things I tried to push him was the human narrative. And if you look at history of humanity, is that, and that's again with Harari or Ray Kurzweil thinks we're going to have singularity in a decade or so. I think it's already happening, but of course in a very, I would say, DNA base, or at least inception base. But if you look at Yuval, and if you look at the humanity evolution, or even organic forms versus version or the forms, we have a big challenge in the way things are managed. And I think my challenge and my question for you on this is, in the middle of this complexity that joins our organic nature, our civilization kind of thrive systems, which we still have. And as well, if you look at even in the history of mankind or the history of organic advances, of course, evolution always tries to clean things, and this is not the stronger, but the faster adapting that goes faster. So I think on this reflection, there is as well more macro, and keeping a bit on this trend. So how do you been coping, especially the big corporations that you've been working? And as well, I know that most of these corporations, in the end of the day, they are actually doing good work. We cannot just accuse them, independent of the way they've been manipulated. Even I think Facebook, I don't think anyone wants to create the damage they did. Of course, Facebook is a bit probably more blaming than the others. But for instance, even Apple, and actually I was reading recently Tim Cook, what he wrote, it was quite impressive because he's as well a very well-educated guy. And what he's saying was in the sense that, for instance, in the case of advertisement, which is where AI is more advanced in a lot of ways, or digital search engines, we had advertisement for decades, or even probably 200 years. And we managed to do that without having to totally disrupt the world economy and the point. But one of the things, actually, there was one author that I like a lot, actually, Maya Zuckerman. She said one thing I really like. She's from San Francisco as well, and she's been working with the World Economic Forum. She said one thing that I think it's particularly important. I didn't thought about, especially the way she put it, is that right now, with all these technologies, we're starting to create almost a parallel sense of reality. And of course, Elon Musk has been talking about this. But for instance, what she said, especially with what happened with US elections not going political, is that a lot of people are kind of believing in a fake reality, but they want to stay there. Some of these people are effectively, of course, there's a percentage of these people that don't have the education, but other people have the education, but they still want to keep in this reality because it was created as a new. So this is for me the most complexity that we have right now with AI short term, even more than all the weapons and things like that. Because what I've been finding out, actually I interviewed recently a director, not a director, but someone from former CIA, is that they actually have much more ethics than you can think, thanks God, for all of us, or thanks whatever you want to thank you. But I think the point here, so a question for you is, how do you see this? Because I think this is where the problem lies. And I think where companies like yours have to act, and we all have to act together, because if we don't really push forward on this, we're going to have a very, very dystopic and cyberpunk, or even worse than that, post-world, whatever we call it. And this is happening, and because I think what happened in Blade Runner in some ways is starting to happen, because we have like 5 corporations that have more cash flow than most of the world, all countries together, and more capacity in terms of data, knowledge, and intelligence. And they can even scale using AI to scale technology, funding, and everything else, because you can put algorithms trading in the and for instance, even if you see the stock markets, and sorry, I'm digressing a bit, but I want to touch all of this in the pilot, or as well in the point is that, for instance, if you look at even the stock markets, which is an area that I've been working for the last 15 years or 16, is the stock markets are all managed at the moment by algorithms. We're talking about 80 to 90% of the money in the world is managed by machines. And this is, so we have in one hand the financial world, the big corporations, and then the governments that most of them have no clue. So I think this is what I would like to see, the work and how you approach as well the day-to-day operations, thinking about this. I know that you are a philosopher as well. That's why I'm pushing these questions.
Well, again, a very complex question, but very good. I'll start with the piece about intentions. And it's true. I would hope, I think a very small percentage actually set out with the intention to do bad. But the different founders are different technology leaders. The intention originally was to make something good, was to help humanity. That intention is always there. And when we work at ethical intelligence, I joke that I'm half therapist, because oftentimes I find myself in these meetings sitting there going, this is good. We're supposed to pull out how bad this technology can go, because then we can make sure it doesn't go there. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. Ethics sits so closely to our understanding of ourselves and what it means to be human. So when I approach someone and say, this may not be the most ethically sound decision, I have to be very careful, because what can happen is that can communicate to the receiving end that I'm a bad person, I made a bad ethical decision. That's not true. We make ethical decisions for our own individual selves daily as people. When it comes to actually implementing those decisions into technology, the scale and the scope that actually reaches, so my one ethical decision that normally only affects myself and maybe a few others around me, if I suddenly implement that into my technology, that can reach millions of people that I've never even met. So it requires a different level of awareness of the decisions you're making. And ethics is very logical. There's methodologies there that you walk through. It's not in numbers, but it is logical that you have to walk through. And as long as you're walking through this logical methodology and bringing that awareness to the ethical impact of your technology, then you're kind of combating part of that. Leading on into your point about how we as humans seem to be creating this virtual life, and half of us are, and there are some of us that are living in that virtual reality that's not true, that it's twisted, the facts are twisted, and it doesn't align with what reality in itself.
So just one note there, but I think one interesting thing on that, and as well as a note, is that the facts is that, so for us, if you look at, and I think Google has been very responsible for that, and Facebook in particular, but of course we have at the moment, I don't know, but there's a couple of millions of people that believe the Earth is not round, just an example, and then other people that are denials of evolution, and these people are using advanced technologies to deny science, which is the irony, is that they're using the platforms that were created actually thanks to the scientific developments to deny this scientific point. So the facts and the science are a bit, and at the moment, for instance, I think if you look, for instance, about 5G, and I think this is interesting because 5G is key, independent of you like it or not, for developing of AI and advances, is that one of the things that happen is that in most of, for instance, in Africa, is considered something from the devil. And I'm not talking about, I would think that this is coming from, I don't know, people less educated. No, this is kind of mainstream. It's actually scary. So I think I think people like us that are associated with big universities and research, we forget the reality. The reality is much more complex than this. I think I come back to your hat as well entrepreneur, and as well using practicality. And I think picking some of your research that I found in your blog and different things. So we have ethics for computer scientists, why you need ethics in ethics now more than ever, of falsehood programmers believe about ethics. So I think all of these things are answering partly what I'm asking you, and I will urge people to read it. But if you can synthesize this, actually probably to wrap up the interview, because we passed 1 hour and a half. And I would love probably do the second round, but we'll do it probably as a panel.
Absolutely. I always love discussing on panels as well. So I think what I'm going to try and summarize the central thread that goes through a lot of these research and these pieces that I write. And that's almost this fact that to be human is chaotic, it's messy, and that's okay. We we've become advanced enough in our societies that we're at the point where we get to start to understand what that chaos is, what that messiness is. And instead of using technology to shy away from it, to using technology as a Band-Aid, for example, over problems that we may have as individuals or as societies, using technology to distract us, to place us in a different reality because we don't want to face the difficult challenges that do exist as being human, that creates problems. And instead of shying away from these difficult questions, facing them head on. And ethics is a very important component of that, because ethics is the gray zone that we're entering into. Technology is black and white. We have done a fantastic job of figuring out this black and white area. And we've done such a great job that we're now into the gray, and we need to figure out what exists in this gray area. And it's scary, it's terrifying, it can be, but it's also beautiful. There's so much opportunity sitting in there to understand what it means to be human at the end of the day as well. And I'll leave on the point that good ethics is synonymous with good business. If a company is ethical, or at least does it to the best of their abilities, again, we are people as well. We mess up, that happens. What we do on the other end of it, how we go back to fix it, that's what actually matters. Not whether or not we messed up, but do we go back and fix our mess? That's the important part. But as we create our businesses and our technologies, if we do so through ethics, with this ever-present understanding of ethics, what happens is we create technology, we create businesses that people can trust and that people can believe in. And technology in general is a highly competitive area. If your firm, if your company is not doing something in the direction of ethics, of sustainability, to help promote the ethical use of technology or the build of it, then 10 years down the line, your company is not going to exist, because the consumer is waking up to these facts, as we're seeing, and they will go with the company that they trust over the one that may be the better product, but if they don't trust it, they're not going to use it. We're now at that, we're hitting that pivotal change point as well. So I'll leave on the mantra of good ethics is just good business at the end of the day.
I love it. And I think you're completely right on that. So I want to just, sorry, you have to evoke you one last time. So, and it's a construct. So I think I'm completely with you about the good ethics and good business, although the complexity, I always like to go to the gray areas. But I think one of the questions is super intelligence. So we didn't touch that. And of course, this could be another 2 hours. But on the super intelligence part, especially because we are getting, I'm not talking singularity, super intelligence, because there's a lot of, I mentioned Google is right now, or not Google, Eric Schmidt is proposing that, but did you do any case on these areas? Because what we see right now is that, for instance, of course, as we start, and that's actually the thesis of Homo Deus, is the idea of super intelligence will disrupt entire. And of course, I believe in Society 5.0 from the Japanese government, but which was actually done by a researcher as well from Tokyo University, or a lot of researchers. But the idea of Society 5.0 is about the concept of a super intelligent society, a bit like Star Trek, that actually can use technology for good and for the parts that you mentioned. And picking in what you just said about the business and the ethics, and as well that ethics paid. But at the same time, this depends a lot of the way you deal, because for instance, if you have like what happened in the last 4 years in the United States, you have as well a very persistent disruption of intelligence, mostly in this case, pure chaotic, that actually create a huge problems that we mentioned. But I want to understand, because in one end, yeah, you can go for super intelligence that can create fantastic things. But if you look at Nazis and the first example of not AI, but technology, which was the first machines of IBM in the case of the concentration camps, which was effectively a case. It's not, so I just want to touch these two different, also the dichotomy of humanity. And on this level, I believe on you, I'm very positive, but I want just to touch this last thing for people listening to us. How do you see that?
Technology, yes. Technology as we create it is neutral. What we do with it determines what the efficacy of it. So we can create a simple program, and how we use it will determine if it is morally wrong or morally right, or what kind of impact it's going to have. In the case of superintelligence or singularity, I think that the understanding, at least, and perhaps I'm protecting my profession here, but when it comes to ethics, I don't think that is not something that will ever be able to be taken over by a system, mainly because it's so contextually heavy. There are so many nuances within it that it's next to impossible to bring into a line of code. But on the topic of superintelligence, I do think that if we keep the mindset of awareness of what we're creating and not just blindly create it because it turns a nice profit or we can get funding in for that research, but actually pay attention to what we're creating and consider the impacts long-term of what we're creating, then there's potential to use it for good, of course. I think, though, that we need to slow down in a way, which is counterintuitive. Everything's move fast, break things, fail fast, fail hard. But we've hit a point in our technology development where it's no longer the fear of failure that we're trying to overcome, but the fear of pausing and reflecting on what we're actually creating. And that is going to make all the difference in the case of a potential superintelligence, in the case of our day-to-day technology as well. What are we creating for the future? What are we giving to the future generations? Is it something good that they can use, or has it gotten so far out of our control that it's something that will impact them in a very harmful way? We need to ask those questions, and we need to ask them now, yesterday, but now is a great time to start.
I think it's a wonderful way, and it all comes down to that, to education, to the way we coach and prepare people. So Olivia, of course, I definitely will come back to more things, because I'm very excited about this, and of course it's an area that I'm quite passionate. So I want to thank you, first of all, this fantastic thing, 1 hour and a half of research that I think everyone should listen. I would suggest as well that everyone listening to us that go to oliviagambelin.com website, and as well to her company, because there's a lot of research, or just search her name because she's all over the internet, and as well in the good way. I think we need to actually put more, but people need to read and study, because that's the important thing here. And I think I thank you as well for the work you've been doing, because we need people like you to have the, I think, like you put it, the motivation, and as well the initiative, and I think you put it in another word, I just miss it now, but I think the way of pushing this to people. Thank you so much, Olivia.
Thank you, Dinis. I loved your questions. They were very complex. They got me thinking. So thank you for waking me up over my morning coffee.
So, well, no, pleasure is all mine, and I'm very excited as well for what you said, and I will study more. Thank you so much.